Hello and welcome to OPA GCSE Sociology, and today we're going to be looking at what is an ethnography. So let's not bother with the do now because that's something we was doing in class, a bit of marking. So we're going to jump straight into task one. What is an ethnography? So just for task one, just write down a definition and then pause the video. Just give yourself 5 minutes to write it down. So an ethnography is a study of a culture and a structure of a group of people within society. It concentrates on providing detailed accounts of the social world being studied. This is usually done by long-term observations and descriptions of groups. It is associated with anthropology. So just like an anthropologist will go out and study very isolated and rural social groups, so too will a sociologist go and study for long periods of time various social groups in their society. So why is an ethnography different from an ordinary observation? It does sound very similar to an observation, but there are two or three key differences between an observation and an ethnography. And I just want you to note down these differences. So firstly, not all ethnographies are solely observations. They can be observations alongside interviews. So often ethnographies can be covert and some of the participants, without even realizing, can be interviewed informally, or it may be that it's actually overt. So the participant is aware of it and alongside being observed, they're being interviewed after. Secondly, a researcher goes home at the end of an observation. Whereas with an ethnography, like an anthropologist, they may stay in that social world for long periods of time, sometimes months on end. So the ethnographic research will immerse themselves in that world, living like their participant. So 24/7 until they have got all the data they need. And then finally, it's an acknowledgement there that ethnographies are like observations in terms of they can be covert, but they are sometimes overt as well. So just pause the video there, just make some notes, some acknowledgements of their differences. Right, so for task 3, there isn't a video for this, but obviously we're watching the recording, so you're just going to have to try and find a video on this on YouTube. Just some things to note though about ethnographies. Research that requires a long period of time. They explore private or domestic parts of the social life. Often researchers need to understand both how the people think as well as what they are doing. They need to also understand the micro context. So it's not just the macro context in terms of their political world or their world in terms of their workplace. It's also understanding the relationships they have with individuals. And the research needs to be descriptive and encourage reflections. So these are essentially the key elements we're going over of what an ethnography is. So you might want to just pause the video just briefly and just write down a few of those characteristics of an ethnography. Right, so in class for this task, we actually had a carousel task where we went around and we looked at 3 different ethnographic studies. So what we're going to do, just so that we're saving time, I'm just going to give an example of one. I'm going to choose Dick Hobbs, the business, talking with thieves, gangsters and dealers. And it's just giving you an idea of what an ethnographic study will do. So as I'm reading through just a short summary of that ethnography, it's worth just noting down some of the key elements of that study. So what it is, how Dick Hobbs went about researching it, just as a reference point, a good example, if a question relating to ethnographies ever came up. So Using his connections to the East End during his time working as a bin man and drinking in the local Plaistow pubs, Dick Hobbs covertly immersed himself in the side of organised crime, working for a gang. The gang specialised in grand theft auto and drug dealing. Hobbs found these criminals often had a fluid and blurred understanding of crime and morality, often being disgusted with white-collar acts of corruption and crime. So when we refer to white-collar crimes, that's crimes generally committed by the middle class. So things like tax avoidance or fraud. So they were disgusted by that, but were simultaneously justifying their own criminality within their gangs. So things like assaults and drug dealing. Often seeing these acts as working class forms of rebellion. Hobbs was impressed by how the gang was organised, comparable to organisations of a legitimate business, adopting corporate values, having a division of labour in which people could work up in roles. So he actually observed people who almost went through the equivalent of a promotion, almost like a structure of higher management, middle management, and lower management, or lower workers, as well as this sort of regional manager role where people would essentially be looking after gangs in different regions and branching out. Hobbs also noted when recruiting new gang members amongst the ranks, discussions were like conventional interviews within pubs. So they would ask them, just like they would in interviews, things like what made them qualified. They may not be using that terminology, but they would be asking things essentially with the same motivation. So there's a few things there that Hobbs acknowledged that were quite interesting. The fact how criminal gangs were organised was comparable to modern capitalism. The fact that a lot of these gangs were sympathetic to working class criminality as opposed to middle class criminality, and just some of the values that they adapted, very corporate culture. So before you go on and pause the video to do your summary, there's two other examples you could acknowledge here. So one of them is In Family and Kingship in East London by Michael Young and Paul Wilmot. And then the final one of the original ethnographic studies in sociology in Street Corner Society by William White. So just for task 4, like I said before, if you just make a summary of the Dick Hobbs, the business ethnography, and then we'll move on to the next task. Right, finally, what are the strengths and weaknesses of ethnographies? So it's a direct form of observation. It's extremely in depth because you're spending so much time within that social world. And because you get so much depth, you get a very rounded picture of that social world. So it's very high in validity. And it helps to make comparisons between various social groups and cultures. So some of the downsides, it's strong in description, but it often is very weak in analysis. So what that means, in other words, is it lacks reliability. It's data that's not very easily replicated or repeatable, and it's not at all standardized. So it's very hard to actually measure it in quantitative data. And obviously, if it's a covert study, or if it's studying something dangerous, there are many ethical concerns. So things around consent, so whether the participants actually given consent to be observed and interviewed, and if anyone comes in harm's way, if it's on tackling a delicate subject. And as we've said previously, for observations, if they are aware, so if it is an overt observation, there can be observer effects where the participant changes their behavior based on what they perceive the researcher wants. And one that doesn't really come up very often is very expensive and time consuming. So some of these studies, I know the Dick Hobbs study lasted anywhere between 3 to 6 months. depending on where he references the study. Regardless, that is a long time to commit yourself to a study, and it's very expensive. So just pause the video there for the next 5 minutes, just acknowledge 2 to 3 strengths and weaknesses, get them noted down. And then finally, we're going to finish on a 4-mark question surrounding ethnographies. And you can in fact use this template, and you could use this question and just change out the word advantage for disadvantage. So identify and explain one advantage of using an ethnography to research criminal gangs. Okay, so you've got a template and structure here. Just a breakdown of the question. You're going to get 2 marks, 1 for identifying that advantage and 2 just for briefly explaining it. Okay, so one advantage of using ethnography to study criminal gangs is that it's high in validity. Something along the lines of that. You get 2 marks for that. You then just explain why it's an advantage or a disadvantage. So I'm not going to tell you why it's an advantage. Okay. And then you just add the context. So you might come up with your own example. You might refer to, say, Dick Hobbs' study that we just mentioned previously for your context mark.